As tensions grow between Europe and Russia, a military simulation produced results that are very troubling for the West. It revealed a fundamental weakness of Europe, a weakness that Russia could exploit very quickly and very effectively, not in years, not in months, but within days. The scenario assumes a limited attack, a short operation, and minimal forces, yet it still ends with a clear result, a significant strategic victory for Vladimir Putin. The first hours of the conflict. What the simulation showed: the scenario does not begin with a massive attack or a declaration of war. It begins with a series of incidents on the border between Lithuania and Russia, which Moscow attributes to security provocations and the activities of special forces. Lithuania responds by closing the borders. This is followed by a Russian response, a statement that a humanitarian crisis is emerging in Kaliningrad and that it is necessary to secure land transit through Lithuanian territory. Vilnius refuses. At this moment, the situation will break. Russia is moving troops from Kaliningrad and from Belarus, where after a military exercise, some soldiers are already staying directly on site. The operation is starting quickly, without long preparations, without large movements, without massive mobilization that would immediately trigger an alarm across all of Europe. This is a limited intervention with a clear goal: to occupy key sections of the so-called Suwałki corridor. Russian units are advancing toward a strategic point in the south of Lithuania. In the simulation, they managed to occupy the city of Mariupol and other important areas, effectively cutting off the only land connection between the Baltics and the rest of NATO. All of this happens in a very short period of time. Not in weeks, but during the first hours and days of the operation. At this point, Russian troops are already on the territory of a NATO member state. And this is where the simulation shows something fundamental. Even though this is a clear violation of borders, the conflict does not immediately turn into an open war between the alliance and Russia. This is followed by a phase of uncertainty, waiting, and political consultations. And during this time, Russia consolidates the positions it has gained. The first 3 days, a decisive time. The simulation focuses on the first 3 days after the operation begins. Not on a long-term war, not on months of fighting, but on a short time window in which the outcome is decided. It is precisely these 3 days that decide whether the situation can still be reversed or whether the new state will become a reality that the West will have to learn to live with. After the initial advance, Russia does not stop its troops. On the contrary, it immediately strengthens its positions in the occupied territory. In the simulation, there is a rapid securing of key communication lines, deployment of defense systems, and the use of drones to monitor the area. Minefields and obstacles appear, which significantly hinder any rapid counterattack. The goal is clear: to buy time and turn a swift strike into a done deal. While the situation on the ground is stabilizing, a completely different process is beginning at the political level. NATO member states are exchanging information, holding consultations, emergency meetings, and assessing the situation. There is a discussion about whether this is a full-scale attack or a limited operation, whether it is still possible to talk about an incident or already about a war, and most importantly, when and how to respond. It is at this point that the simulation reveals a fundamental problem. During the 3 days it observes, the Russian troops cannot be pushed out of the occupied territory. There is no immediate joint military response. Instead, caution prevails. There is an effort to prevent escalation and to seek political consensus. Russia thus remains on the territory of a NATO member state, and with each passing day it strengthens its position. After 3 days, the result is clear. Russia has achieved its main goal. It has established a land connection between Kaliningrad and Belarus, and it has fundamentally changed the security reality in the region. And all of this without a massive war, without major battles, and without having to face an immediate military response from the alliance. What did NATO do? And more importantly, what did it not do? At this point, the simulation shifts focus from the battlefield to the decision-making tables. Russian troops are already on the territory of a NATO member state, but the alliance does not respond in a unified or immediate way. In the scenario, the United States is closely monitoring the situation, but the Russian justification for the operation is a limited intervention with a humanitarian goal. That is enough for Washington to stay on the sidelines and wait in the first days. There is no quick signal that would clearly say this is a red line. Poland responds by mobilizing and strengthening its own territory, but it does not send its troops across the border into Lithuania. Fears of escalation and uncertainty about whether this is already a full-scale war outweigh the urge for an immediate counterattack. Germany focuses on diplomatic measures and sanctions. At the same time, however, it avoids direct military intervention. The simulation shows that it is precisely Germany's hesitation that has a fundamental impact on the overall development of the situation. The key moment comes during the discussion about activating Article 5. It is indeed on the table, but instead of a quick decision, a series of consultations, legal interpretations, and political considerations begins. Time is passing, and time is working in Russia's favor. Every hour without a clear response means further strengthening of its positions on the ground. The simulation thus shows the harsh reality. The alliance has enormous military potential, but in the first days of the crisis, it runs into its own decision-making process. It's not the failure of one country, but the sum of caution, differing interests, and fear of escalation. And this very moment proves to be decisive in this scenario. Russia isn't winning because it's stronger. It's winning because it reacts faster. Why the Suwałki corridor? Only now does the simulation make full sense. The Suwałki corridor isn't just some stretch on the map. It's a narrow strip of land between Poland and Lithuania. Only a few dozen kilometers wide, it forms the only land connection between the Baltic states and the rest of NATO. On one side is Kaliningrad, on the other is Belarus. Two areas where Russia has a military presence and the ability to act quickly. If this corridor is cut off, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia find themselves in a completely different situation. Ground reinforcements from Poland won't be able to reach them. Only the air and sea routes remain, which are slower, more vulnerable, and significantly complicate any rapid response. That's exactly why the Suwałki corridor has long been considered the weakest point in NATO's defense on the eastern flank. The simulation shows that Russia is fully aware of this weakness. It's not an attempt to occupy a large territory or to march on the main cities. It's a surgical strike at one specific location that has a huge strategic effect. It's enough to break this narrow strip, and the security architecture of the entire region will start to collapse. That's exactly why this scenario is so dangerous. It's not about a big war, but about a quick change of reality. And once this reality settles, reversing it would mean a much bigger conflict with much higher costs and risks. Who created this simulation and what was their goal? This simulation wasn't created as an internet speculation or as political propaganda. It was created in cooperation between the German Daily Die Welt and the Military Wargaming Center at Helmut Schmidt University, which closely collaborates with the German armed forces. The scenario involved military analysts, former high-ranking officers, security experts, and people with direct experience from intelligence services. Their goal was not to predict the future or to draw up a specific plan for a Russian invasion. The purpose of the simulation was to test the decision-making of the West in a crisis situation. How quickly information arrives, who has the authority to act, where the process slows down, and what happens when military reality meets politics. Even the authors of the simulation themselves emphasize that this is not a prediction of what will definitely happen. It's about identifying weak points, and that's exactly where its value lies. It shows where hesitation, chaos, and a time vacuum could arise, which the opponent could take advantage of before the alliance manages to unite. In other words, the simulation doesn't say that Russia will attack tomorrow. It says that if it decided to act quickly, purposefully, and below the threshold of open war, the West's response might not be automatic or immediate. And that's exactly the warning this simulation points out. What did the simulation deliberately simplify? Even the authors of the simulation themselves openly admit that it is not a perfect reflection of reality. Some elements were deliberately simplified or suppressed in order to focus on one specific problem: the speed of decision-making and the political response of the alliance. That's why the scenario does not focus on details about long-term mobilization, massive troop movements, or full-scale defensive operations. For example, the simulation does not work in detail with the immediate response of local forces in Lithuania, nor with how the coordination of the Baltic armies would look in the first hours of the conflict. It also takes a simplified approach to the issue of intelligence warnings, which in the real world would probably come earlier and be more significant. All of these are factors that would play an important role in a real conflict. At the same time, however, these very simplifications reveal the essence of the problem. The simulation does not ask whether NATO has enough tanks, aircraft, or soldiers. It asks what will happen in the first days, when it is still unclear whether it is a war or a limited incident. When legal definitions, political statements, and fears of escalation mix with the reality on the ground. And at this point, the message of the simulation is extremely powerful. Even if some assumptions are different in practice, the fundamental problem remains the same. If the adversary acts quickly, deliberately, and below the threshold of open war, hours and days are decisive. Not military plans on paper, but the ability to act immediately. And it is precisely this ability that the simulation calls into serious question. A risk for Russia, Kaliningrad, as a weak spot. However, the simulation does not only reveal Europe's weaknesses, it also shows that such a move would not be without risk for Russia. On the contrary, it would be a strategic gamble with very high stakes. The key problem for Moscow is Kaliningrad. While it serves as the pretext for the entire operation in the scenario, it is also its greatest weakness. The Kaliningrad region is an isolated Russian exclave surrounded by NATO member states. In the event of open conflict, it would be constantly vulnerable. Supplying it by sea or air would be at risk, and maintaining control over the region would require constant military protection. If NATO decided to respond forcefully, Kaliningrad could quickly become a target of pressure that Moscow would struggle to handle. That's why the simulation assumes a very narrow time window. Russia would not try to wage a long war. Its goal would be to quickly create a new situation, force the West to accept reality, and get into a position from which further escalation would be extremely difficult for NATO, both politically and militarily. The longer the conflict lasted, the greater the risk for Russia would become. According to the scenario, Russian military officials realized that if the alliance decided to act together and immediately, it could lead to losing much more than Moscow would gain. That's why the simulation doesn't rely on a massive attack formation, but on speed, ambiguity, and political pressure. It's a game of nerves, not about conquering territories. And it's at this point that the whole scenario shows how fragile it is. Russia would have to bet that NATO wouldn't want to risk a major war. However, if the alliance decided otherwise, the price would be high, not just for Europe, but also for Moscow itself. What does this simulation actually say? This simulation is not a guide to war nor a prediction of the future. It's a reality check. It shows that in a modern conflict, victory may not depend on the size of the army or the number of weapons, but on the speed of decision-making and the political courage to act in the first hours and days, exactly at the moment when it's still unclear whether it's a war or just a crisis. It also shows that the biggest risk for Europe is not an open front, but the gray zone. A situation in which the opponent acts quickly, deliberately, and below the threshold of an immediate military response, and in which the response takes longer to find than is safe. In such an environment, a small territorial gain can turn into a strategic defeat. At the same time, however, the simulation also reminds us of the other side of the coin. Such a move would be a huge gamble for Russia. He would be betting that the West would back down to avoid escalation. However, if he were wrong, the consequences would be serious and long-lasting. That's exactly why this is a high-risk game for both sides. The question this simulation raises, therefore, is not whether such a scenario will occur. The question is whether Europe is ready to act before the crisis becomes a reality, and whether it can make decisions at a time when they are still politically uncomfortable but strategically necessary.
If you liked the video, I would appreciate a like, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the others I'm currently working on. You can support my work through gratitude. And if you want to get the video to more people, click on praise. I appreciate it.